My name is Bernard Coté. I am 67 years old. I worked as a bush pilot in the Omineka country of northern British Columbia for 22 years, and before that I flew fire patrol out of Prince George. And before that I was a young man who did not know very much about anything, which is the condition most young men share, and almost none of them recognize until it is too late to be useful. I am recording this into my daughter Sylvie's telephone, which she has shown me how to use for this one purpose, and I am sitting at the kitchen table of a cabin I have known since I was 19 years old. In the third week of October, 3 weeks and 4 days after my aunt Marguerite Pelletier Coté died, in this cabin at the age of 81, with her hands folded on the quilt her mother had made and her eyes already pointed somewhere past the ceiling. There is a tin box on this table. I have not opened it. I will tell you why before I am done. I want to say first that I am not a man who tells stories for the pleasure of telling them. I flew the same supply routes for 2 decades, and I kept my logbooks and I said what I saw, and I did not embellish, because embellishment in that country gets people killed. And I have carried that habit into the rest of my life. I am telling this now because Marguerite is gone, and because my daughter Sylvie, who is a careful and intelligent woman, and who loved her great aunt, and who asked Marguerite twice in the last 6 years of her life to take a simple cheek swab that would have told us something, got a refusal both times that she has never stopped thinking about. The first time was in the winter of 2019, when Sylvie drove up from Terrace with the test kit from the pharmacy and sat across this same table and explained patiently that it was just a bit of saliva on a cotton swab, and the results would only go to her, to us, to the family. Marguerite listened to all of it. She was 76 years old, and her hair had gone the color of birch bark, and her hands on the table were the hands of someone who had worked with them every day for 60 years. And she listened to Sylvie the way she listened to everything, which was with her full attention and without interrupting. And then she said, in a voice so quiet that Sylvie had to lean forward to catch the end of it, that she already knew everything the test would tell her, and that she did not need a machine to confirm it. The second time was in the spring of 2021. The answer was the same. Marguerite said, "I know what I know." She said it without sadness, and without anger, and without the particular quality of a person who is hiding something, and knows they are hiding it. She said it the way a woman says a thing she has made peace with over a very long time. This is what I told Sylvie after, and Sylvie said, "Yes, but that is exactly what someone would say if they were afraid of what it would show." And I thought about that for a long while. I am still thinking about it. I think Sylvie is right, but not in the way she means. To explain what I mean, I have to go back to my uncle Felix. Felix Coté was my mother's younger brother, born in 1922 in the Lac-Saint-Jean country of Quebec, the 6th of 7 children, and he came west the way a lot of men from that part of the world came west in the late 1940s, which is to say with a strong back and the address of a man who was said to need one. He was 30 years old when he arrived in the Omineka country, and he was 32 when he met Marguerite Pelletier, who was working then as a cook at a prospecting camp near the upper Finlay River, and who was 20 years old and very serious, and who could read a weather system by watching the spruce on the north side of the valley better than any instrument the camp had. They were married in October of 1952 in a ceremony held in the largest of the camp's 3 buildings, because the nearest church was 4 hours by truck, and the road was not reliable in October, and Angus Mackinnon, who ran the supply operation out of the nearest settlement, and who was, by common agreement, the closest thing the district had to an authority of any kind, witnessed the papers and signed his name in a hand that Marguerite once described to me as the handwriting of a man who had learned it late and meant every letter. I never met Felix. He disappeared in March of 1954, 6 weeks before I was born. What happened to Felix Cote is not something I can tell you with any authority, because nobody knows, and the people who might have known are mostly gone. He went out on a trap line on the 3rd of March, which was a Wednesday, with a sled and 2 dogs, and enough supply for 4 days. He did not come back after 4 days. He did not come back after a week. A search party went out, organised by Angus Mackinnon. 8 men covering the most likely routes across 4 days, and they found the sled overturned in a creek bed, with 1 runner snapped clean off. And they found the traces of the 2 dogs, who had clearly pulled free and gone their own way. And they found nothing else. The creek bed was in a narrow cut between 2 ridges north and west of the cabin, and the snow had come again heavily that week and covered whatever tracks might have told a clearer story. The search party came back. Marguerite was informed. That was what there was to know. She was 21 years old, and she had been married for 17 months. She stayed in the cabin through March and into April, and Ida Mackinnon, who was Angus's wife, and who was a woman of considerable practical competence and very few unnecessary words, came and stayed with her for the first 2 weeks, and then came every few days after that. Marguerite did not ask for help, and she did not refuse it. She kept the wood stove going, and she kept the cabin in order, and she did not, as far as anyone could see, stop functioning. She was the kind of woman grief falls on differently than it falls on the rest of us. Not harder and not lighter, just differently, the way snow settles differently on different kinds of trees, according to their shape. In the middle of April, on a day Ida Mackinnon would remember later as being the first genuinely warm day of that spring, with the south-facing slopes bare already, and a smell of meltwater coming off everything, Marguerite told Ida she was going to go look for Felix herself. Ida said. The search party looked. Marguerite said, "I know the country differently than they do," which was true. She had been in those ridges since 1952, and she had gone with Felix on the shorter lines, often enough that she knew the territory, the way a person knows a piece of land they have walked in all weathers and all seasons, which is a different kind of knowledge than the kind that comes from a map. She took what she needed for a week's travel. She told Ida she would be back in a week or less. She left on the 17th of April. She came back on the 14th of May. That is 27 days. I do not know what happened in those 27 days. Nobody knows. Marguerite did not say, not then and not ever, not to Ida, and not to Angus, and not to Thomas Alexis, who was a carrier man from a family that had used that country for generations, and who traded at the same post as Angus, and who was at the settlement when Marguerite walked in on the afternoon of the 14th, thinner than she had left, and with her boots worn almost through, but with a look on her face that Thomas would describe to me 40 years later as the look of a woman who has been to the edge of the known world and has found that it is not the edge of anything, that the world simply continues on the other side into something large and quiet, and not at all what she had been told. Thomas told me he said to her, I am glad you are safe, Madame Cote. He told me he did not ask her anything else, because he already had, in that moment, understood that she had found something other than Felix, and that she had made a decision about it, and that it was not his decision to unmake. She had found something other than Felix. That is the only way I know how to say it. She was 3 months pregnant when she came back. This was not apparent immediately. She was thin from the weeks in the bush, and she wore her shirts loose. But by August it was clear, and Ida knew in July, and Ida told Angus, and Angus told nobody else, because Angus Mackinnon was above all things a man who understood the difference between what was his business and what was not. The settlement was small enough that keeping a secret required everyone's deliberate cooperation, and that cooperation was given, collectively and without a meeting ever being called to organize it, the way that certain communities give certain things, which is through each person separately arriving at the same understanding and then behaving accordingly. There were 11 permanent residents of that settlement in the summer of 1954, and not one of them said a word to anyone outside the valley about Marguerite's condition, and not one of them asked her a question she did not wish to answer. Odette Cote was born on the 21st of November, 1954, in the cabin with Ida Mackinnon attending and with Angus waiting outside on the porch, in a cold that had gone well below freezing and had been below freezing for 2 weeks. Ida told me, when I finally spoke to her about all of this in the winter of 1998, that Odette weighed 9 pounds and 4 ounces at birth, which was on the large side, but not remarkable, and that she was entirely healthy, and that the only thing Ida would say about the child's appearance was that her eyes were very dark and very attentive, and that she looked at you with a focus that felt, even at that age, as if she was already deciding what she thought of you. Ida said this to me, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She was a beautiful child." She said this without elaboration and without any suggestion that she meant anything other than exactly what she said. I believed her. I believe that Odette was beautiful, and I believe that the word means something slightly different when applied to a child, who is not entirely the thing you expect her to be. I did not meet Odette until she was 12 years old, in the summer of 1966, when I came up to the Omineka country for the first time with my mother to visit the aunt we had heard about but never met. I was 12 myself. I remember the drive up from Prince George on roads that were only intermittently paved, and I remember the cabin appearing at the end of a track through second-growth spruce as something smaller and more self-contained than I had imagined, with a kitchen garden on the south side and a woodpile that was the most organized object I had ever seen, every piece the same length and the whole structure as tight as a wall. I remember Marguerite opening the door before we knocked, as if she had known we were coming down the track, and I remember that she was not what I had expected, which was grief visible in the face. She looked, instead, like a woman who had settled something fundamental about herself a long time ago, and had been at peace with the settlement ever since. She had grey in her hair already at 33, and her face had the particular quality of people who live in cold and open country, which is a fineness of skin over the bones that makes the structure of the skull visible, and her eyes were the same brown as the bark of a birch in winter. Odette was in the garden when we arrived, and she came to the door of the cabin and stood behind Marguerite for a moment, before Marguerite stepped aside to let her through. She was, as I have said, 12 years old. She was tall for 12. She came almost to Marguerite's shoulder, and Marguerite was not a small woman. She had dark hair and dark eyes and hands that seemed large for the rest of her, not disproportionate, exactly, but present in the way that the hands of people who use them for serious work are present as a tool that has already been formed for its purpose. She did not smile when she was introduced. She looked at my mother and then at me with a directness that was not rudeness. It was, I understand now, simply the way she looked at everything, which was with the full weight of her attention applied, without any of the social softening most people use to make attention feel less like scrutiny. I shook her hand. It was a firm handshake for a 12-year-old. I remember thinking, not in words, but in the way things register before you have the language for them, that she was unlike anyone I had met. We stayed for 4 days. I played in the yard with the camp dog, a red heeler named Cord, who was 7 years old and had learned through long practice to ignore children without hostility. And I watched Marguerite and my mother sit at the kitchen table for hours in the evenings, talking in the low, continuous murmur of women who have known each other through a third person they are both thinking about. I watched Odette. She was comfortable in the bush in a way I was not. She moved through the spruce at the edge of the clearing with a quiet that I recognized as different from the quiet of a careful person, and more like the quiet of something that belongs there, that does not need to adjust its weight or its breathing, because the environment has already accounted for it. She showed me where the creek ran under the alders, and where the grouse nested, and what the beaver had done to the stand of aspen on the west side of the property. She told me the name of every tree in both English and in what I later understood was her own private version of the carrier language, which she had learned from Thomas Alexis and his family, and which she spoke more naturally than she spoke English in certain moments. I asked her once if she ever got lonely up here. She thought about that for what seemed like a long time. Then she said, "There is more here than you can see." She said it simply, as a statement of fact, with no suggestion that she was trying to be interesting about it. I have thought about that answer for 55 years. I left with my mother at the end of those 4 days, and I did not come back to that country until I was 19 and had already decided I was going to fly. And I came back because the man who ran the Ominaka supply route out of Fort St. James was looking for someone who could navigate by landmarks and who was not afraid of small plains in mountain weather, and someone had given him my name. That man was a pilot named Gilles Ouellet, who was 51 years old and who had been flying that country since 1948, and who knew every ridge and every thermal and every valley where the weather changed without warning, and who flew with the particular economy of movement of someone who has never had a surplus of anything to waste. Gilles hired me in the spring of 1971, and I flew with him for 2 years before I took over the route myself. And in those 2 years, I relearned the whole of that country from the air, which is a different country than the one you know from the ground. The same terrain, read from another angle so that the whole shape of it becomes clear in a way it never is when you are standing inside it. Marguerite's cabin was on my supply route. I stopped there every 3 weeks in the flying season, which ran from late April through early November, bringing fuel and flour and the other things she had ordered through Gilles, and I took coffee with her at the kitchen table and talked about the weather and the condition of the ridges. And occasionally, about Odette. Odette was in her 20s by then, and she spent part of the year at the cabin and part of the year elsewhere. The elsewhere, always vague, described by Marguerite, with a sideways tilt of her head. That meant the question was welcome, but the answer was not available. I understood that Odette's movements were not entirely in the human grid of roads and settlements, and that asking about them directly was not the right approach. And so I did not ask directly, and Marguerite and I talked about everything else. And over time, I came to understand that she was someone I trusted in the specific way you trust a person who has never told you anything they did not mean, and who has never told you more than you needed to know. It was in the summer of 1974 that I saw them from the air. I want to be careful about this. I am a pilot. I know what I see, and I know what light does to things at different altitudes. And I know the difference between a clear visual acquisition and an uncertain one. And what I saw that afternoon was a clear visual acquisition in good light at an altitude of approximately 1,200 feet above the ground. I was flying north and slightly west of Marguerite's cabin, following the line of a ridge toward a lake I used as a navigation point, and I was over a stretch of high meadow above the tree line, the kind of ground that opens up above 8,000 feet into a flat expanse of sedge, and heath and dwarf willow, where the view from the air is unobstructed for a long distance in every direction. It was a clear afternoon in late July. There was no haze. The sun was behind me and slightly to my left, which meant the light was coming full onto the meadow from a low angle that would have made a shadow of anything standing in it. There were two figures standing in the meadow. One of them was Odette. I knew her from the way she stood, which was with her weight slightly forward and her shoulders square, the posture of someone who is comfortable with open ground. She was wearing a dark jacket, and her hair was loose. The other figure was behind her and to her left, and it was standing upright, and it was, as best as I could estimate from 1,200 feet in a plane, doing 120 knots, approximately 9 feet tall. It was dark brown, the color of spruce bark in deep shadow, and it was very still, the way animals are still when they are watching something and deciding whether it warrants movement. It was not facing me. It was facing Odette, or rather it was beside her and slightly behind her, in the position of something that is accompanying rather than following. And the two of them together in that meadow had the quality of a composition that had not been arranged but simply existed, like a tree beside a rock, each thing in its place, and neither requiring the other to explain itself. I did not circle. I did not change my course. I looked for the time it takes to fly across a meadow at 120 knots, which is not very long, and then the ridge was below me and the meadow was behind me, and I held my heading and did not speak into the radio and did not write anything in the log. And when I landed at Fort St. James, I sat in the plane for a while before I got out. Gilles was in the hangar, and he looked at me when I came in, and he did not ask anything for a long moment, and then he said, "You've been up over the high country today." It was not a question. I said yes. He said, "There are things up in that country that are old." He said it, the way he said most things, which was without inflection, as a piece of information passed from one navigator to another, a notation on the chart. Then he went back to what he was doing. I never asked him what he meant. I have thought about the way he said it, the particular flatness of it, the absence of any register that would signal whether he thought it was remarkable. For 51 years now, and I have come to believe that Gilles Ouellet had been flying that country for more than 20 years. By the time he said that to me, and that he had seen things from the air that he had filed away under the same category of information as weather patterns and fuel consumption, observed, noted, and not discussed. Because not discussing it was the correct professional response to information that the instruments had no way of processing, I did not speak to Marguerite about what I had seen for a long time. I came on my supply runs every 3 weeks, and I drank my coffee, and I talked about the ridges, and she asked after Sylvie, who was a baby then, and after my wife Denise, and I brought her mail and her fuel, and I said nothing. What would I have said? I knew by then that the relationship between Marguerite and the truth she was carrying was a long-established one, that she had been living inside this particular arrangement since before I was born, and that the protocol she had developed for it was not a protocol of concealment, so much as a protocol of privacy, which is a different thing. Concealment is about fear. Privacy is about the right of certain things to exist without being named. It was in the winter of 1984 that she showed me the clay handprint. I had stopped at the cabin on one of my last runs of the season, in early November, when the snow was already down on the high country, and the light was going by 4 in the afternoon, and the spruce on the north side of the valley had the particular grey-blue colour they take in low winter sun. Marguerite made coffee, and we sat at this table, and after a while she got up and went to the back room and came back with a piece of bark, birch bark the size of a cutting board, and on it was pressed a print in dried clay. The clay had been applied to the bark in a layer about an inch thick, and then the hand had been pressed into it while it was still wet, and the whole thing had dried into something permanent. The print was large. I put my palm against it, and the span of the hand went 3 inches past my fingers on one side and 3 inches past the heel of my palm on the other. My hand is not small. I estimated the width of the print at approximately 17 inches across the widest point. The palm impression was deep, and the fingers were long, and the lines of the skin were there in the clay, fine and detailed, exactly as a human handprint would show them. Marguerite set it on the table between us, and she did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "She made this the autumn before last." She was referring to Odette. Odette had pressed the hand into the clay and let it dry, and given it to Marguerite, and Marguerite had kept it in the back room for 2 years before she showed it to me. I looked at it for a long time. I did not ask the question that was underneath everything else I might have asked, which was, whose hand was Odette using as the model? Or was the print Odette's own? Or was it something else entirely? I did not ask because I understood that the showing was the answer, and that the answer was the only kind of answer Marguerite was able to give, which was a physical fact presented without commentary, a piece of evidence offered and then returned to the shelf. I said, "She made this herself." Marguerite said, "Yes," I said. "It's a beautiful thing," Marguerite said. "She is." Then she picked it up and took it back to the room, and we finished our coffee, and I flew out before the light was entirely gone. I have thought about that handprint for 40 years. I have thought about the 17 inches across the widest point, and I have thought about the precision of the skin lines in the dried clay, which means the hand was pressed in with enough patience and enough pressure to record that level of detail, which means whoever made the print was not in a hurry and not afraid of the process. I have come to understand it as the kind of gesture a person makes when they want to say, I am real. I exist at this size, in this shape, and these are the lines of my skin, and they are specific to me and to no one else. I understand it as a statement of existence made to the one person in the world who would receive it without question. That person was Marguerite. Odette walked into the Omineka bush on the 14th of August 1989. She was 34 years old. She told Marguerite she would be back, and Marguerite told her she believed her, and that is the last recorded human world account of where Odette Coté went. I say recorded as a manner of speaking. Nothing was formally recorded, because nothing was formally reported. Marguerite did not call the ARSEMP. She did not ask Angus Mackinnon to organise a search, because Angus Mackinnon had died in the spring of 1977, and the settlement had dispersed by then, to the point where there was no one left to organise. She did not ask me to fly a search pattern over the high country, though I offered, and my offering was the closest I came to asking directly what had happened, and her refusal was the closest she came to telling me. She said she knows where she is going. She said this 2 weeks after Odette left, when I stopped on a supply run and found Marguerite at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and I sat down and she told me, and I asked if she wanted me to fly north of the cabin, and she said no. She said she knows where she is going. She said it without sadness. She said it the way you say a thing that you have long since accepted as the shape of your life. Not with resignation, but with recognition, the way you recognize the name of a place you have been before. I did not fly north of the cabin. I brought her mail and her fuel every 3 weeks until I stopped flying the route in 1993. And then I came up by truck a few times a year, and she was always in the cabin, and the woodpile was always stocked, and the garden was always in order, and she never said she was lonely. Though I believed she was, in the particular way you are lonely when the person you love most in the world has gone to live in a country you cannot follow her into. She was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. She had chosen every part of her life. She had chosen Felix, and then she had chosen what she found in those 27 days in the bush in the spring of 1954, and then she had chosen to raise Odette in the world that contained both halves of what Odette was, and she had never, as far as I could see, spent a day of her adult life pretending that any of those choices had been mistakes. She lived with the full weight of what she knew, and she managed that weight the way she managed the woodpile, which is to say with a precision and an economy that made the whole thing look simpler than it was. The DNA test. I keep coming back to the DNA test. My daughter Sylvie has a clear and organized mind, and she approached the question the way she approaches most questions, which is by thinking about what the evidence would tell her if she could get it, and what it would mean, and whether the meaning would be useful. She is not a person who asks questions for sentimental reasons. She wanted to know something specific. She wanted to know what Odette was, in the biological sense, in the kind of language a laboratory can read. She thought, and still thinks, that knowing that would be a kind of completion, that it would give the story the ending it has never officially had. I understand the impulse. I share it. Certain moments, in the way you share an impulse you also know you would never act on. But I think Marguerite was right to refuse, and I think the reason she gave was the true reason and not a deflection. She said, I already know everything the test would tell me. I believe she did. I believe that Marguerite Pelletier-Coté, who had been a bush cook and a trapper's wife and a widow at 21, and a mother at 22 and a keeper of a secret for 62 years, knew exactly what her daughter was in every sense of the word, and that what she knew could not be contained in the categories her laboratory uses, and that the laboratory's categories were not the ones that mattered to her. The ones that mattered to her were: Odette was hers. Odette was loved. Odette knew where she was going. These are facts no swab can confirm or deny. But I also think, and this is the part I am less certain of, that Marguerite feared what the test would set in motion. Not for herself. She was past caring what any institution thought of her or her choices. But a result is a record, and a record can be found. And what can be found can be used by people whose idea of usefulness is different from Marguerite's. She had spent 62 years keeping Odette off every grid that existed, and she was not about to hand the last piece of Odette that was available to hand over to a machine that would store it in a database somewhere and call it data. I think the refusal was the last act of protection, and I think it was entirely consistent with every choice she made from the spring of 1954 until the morning she died. She protected what she loved. She did not ask permission. She did not explain herself to anyone whose opinion was less important to her than the thing she was protecting. I am sitting in this cabin now, and the October light is coming through the window that faces the valley, the flat grey light of a day that has not fully decided whether it is overcast or clear, and there is a smell of wood smoke from the stove I lit this morning, and a smell of the cold that comes off the floor, where the insulation under the boards has thinned over the years. Marguerite's things are still in their places. The cup she used is still on the shelf. The photograph of Felix, the only one that survived, is still on the windowsill above the sink. A young man with dark hair and a look of being slightly startled by the camera. The look of someone who did not expect to have his picture taken at that particular moment. There is a book on the table beside the stove, and I have not looked at its title. I am not ready to put her things in boxes yet, which is what I came here to do, and which I have not started. The tin box is on the table in front of me. I found it in the back room, on the shelf above, where she kept the clay handprint. The handprint is there still, on its piece of birch bark, and the tin box was sitting beside it, a small rectangular tin the colour of old tea, with a latch that has rusted slightly at the hinge, but opens cleanly. I opened it this morning, which was the first morning I was here, and I looked at what was inside it, and then I closed it and set it on the table, and I have not opened it again. Inside the box there is a letter, folded twice, written on paper that has yellowed at the edges. The handwriting on the outside is Marguerite's. It is addressed to Odette. I have not read it. I do not know if I will read it, and I do not know if Marguerite intended me to read it, or if she intended it to go somewhere else, to someone I do not know, through a means I cannot guess at. There is a question about what a letter like that is for when the person it is addressed to has walked into the Omineca bush and has not come back in 35 years, and has not, in the opinion of the person who knew her best, gone anywhere she does not mean to be. I do not know if the letter is an explanation or an apology, or a simple account of the ordinary things that happened after Odette left, the small facts of a life continuing without its centre. I do not know if it is any of those things. I know that Marguerite wrote it, and that she kept it in a box beside a 17-inch clay handprint for some portion of the years between 1989 and now, and that she did not destroy it. and that she did not ask me to deliver it, and that she did not ask me to read it or burn it or do anything with it at all. Beside the letter in the tin box is a single pine cone, a lodgepole pine cone, small and tight, the kind that stays closed until it is opened by heat, by fire, or by sustained warmth, before it releases its seed. Someone placed it there deliberately. It did not roll in by accident. It is in perfect condition, the scales tight and undamaged, and it sits in the corner of the tin box, like a thing that is waiting. Thomas Alexis is 91 years old, and he lives in his daughter's house near the settlement, which has changed considerably since 1954, but which still has the particular quality of a place that is aware of being at the edge of something. The last arrangement of human structures before the country opens up into the high ridges and the meadows above the tree line. I spoke to Thomas on the phone last week, before I drove up here. I told him Marguerite had died. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that had not changed very much from the voice I had known for 40 years. She was a woman who understood what she had been given. I said, yes, he said. The bush gives back what it's owed, in time. I did not ask him what he meant by that. I think I understood it, and I think understanding it and being able to say it are two different operations, and the second one is not available to me yet. The world is larger than the grids we lay over it. I have known this since I was a pilot, and the grids were literal, were navigation charts, were radio frequencies and visual reference points, and I learned to navigate between them and beyond them the way you learn any technical skill, which is by doing it in conditions of increasing difficulty until the skill becomes the way you see, and not just the way you act. But I mean something different now, something Marguerite knew and Odette was born into, and Thomas Alexis has lived alongside his whole life, which is that the map is always smaller than the territory, and the territory contains things the map was not designed to record, and the things it was not designed to record are not therefore absent. They are present. They have their own lives. They move through their own country by their own routes, and sometimes those routes intersect with ours, and when they do, the intersection changes both parties in ways that are not fully reversible, and that require, on our part, a certain willingness to let the change stand without naming it too precisely. I have not opened the letter. I do not know, tonight, what I will do with it. I know that if Odette is anywhere she can receive it, she does not need me to deliver it. She will have made her own arrangements through channels that do not include the postal service or any of its equivalents. I know that if she is not anywhere she can receive it, then the letter is for whoever finds it next, which may be me, or may be Sylvie, or may be someone none of us have thought of. I know that Marguerite left it in the box, and left the box on the shelf, and trusted that it would find its way to where it needed to be, because that is what she trusted about most things, which is to say that she trusted the country, and she trusted the people she had chosen to trust, and she let the rest arrange itself according to its own logic. The pine cone is in the corner of the tin box, and it is waiting for heat, for the particular sustained warmth that will open it, and when it opens it will release what it has been holding. I do not think this is a metaphor that Marguerite would have used. She was not a woman for metaphors. I think she put the pine cone there because it was the right object for what she was trying to say, and what she was trying to say was something about patience and timing, and the conditions that have to be present before a thing can release what it holds. I think she knew those conditions better than anyone, and I think she trusted that they would eventually be met. I will leave the letter sealed tonight. The stove is warm and the October dark is coming down over the valley, and the spruce on the north side are going grey-blue in the last of the light, and somewhere above the tree line, above the high meadows that I know from the air, and that Odette knew from the ground, and that the country knows in the way it knows everything, which is completely and without record, there is a world that continues without needing me to confirm it. I know what I know. That is what Marguerite said, and that is what I will say now, sitting at her table with her wood smoke in the air and the tin box in front of me, and the lodgepole pinecone waiting in its corner for the warmth that will open it. I know what I know. No one needs a machine to confirm it.